Yes, welcome. This is F a Rap Critic. I'm your boy Malik 16, and yes, I had to break out that new blue, but no, it's not only on the left side as you can see, because yeah, that's the Crip side. And we ain't claiming no sets here, but shout out to you. No matter what section of the earth you reside in and represent, because we are still building this global hip hop community. And if you have not already, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It's probably about that time where I should leave a disclaimer because it's been a minute since I have. Reminder, if you are one of those folk whose time just doesn't permit you to listen to a full episode or have it playing in the background or sit there glued to the screen watching me break down rapidy rap, always remember that each and every last video on this channel is marked by timestamps that break down each dimension that I cover in each of these episodes. So all 10 of them have timestamps. You can jump around to whichever one matters the most to you. So if you care most about how I describe the mass appeal of the album, how I describe the flow, how I describe the timelessness, or how I describe the poetic wisdom and overall quotability, you can jump around. You don't have to watch a whole hour and 30 minutes of a long episode that feels like, I'll get to it, and you never do. Also, perfect time to remind you to turn on your notification bell so you can see when a new episode pops up, when it's about to come out. And yeah, just trying to make the whole watching and listening experience easy for you. Also available on everywhere podcasts are available if you just want to tune in and listen while you ride. Just giving you options and letting you know what's what. Today we are going over a slightly skewed classic, which is turning 20 years old. We're talking about RNG by Snoop Dogg. And this is category 1, where we go over the album, the product itself. A little background on this release. This is the result of a joint venture between Snoop Dogg and the Star Trek label, which is helmed by the Neptunes, under Geffen Records, which is all within the Interscope family. So for Snoop, it's not a big jump. He started out on Interscope and has remained there for most of his career, but with the exception of the time where he had to jump to No Limit in the late 90s and early 2000s. So speaking of jumping, let's jump into the first dimension of category 1, dimension 1, quality of the production. So if it is a Neptunes led project, it's only right to assume that Chad Hugo and Pharrell Williams are going to be manning the boards, which they do provide the sonics behind at least almost half of the album. And most of the things written about this album state that this partnership was spawned from Snoop first teaming up with Pharrell to record the smash hit Beautiful from the album prior to this one, Paid the Cost to Be the Boss. And so from that, Star Trek had started making waves. This was a very talked about, buzzed about album in the early 2000s. People were waiting to see what came of it. And a few luminaries did come from under the umbrella when you think about Khalees and Robin Thicke. But for Snoop to be such a staple artist in hip hop, and for Neptunes to be such a mega presence in music in general, this meeting of worlds was a big deal. In a lot of ways, it helped to really solidify and validate the Star Trek label as a house of hits with having a brand artist. And then at the same time, the Neptunes helped to rejuvenate Snoop's career in a way that didn't need, but it really took it over the top. But with that, they're not selfish. Snoop is still sharing this space and providing a platform for a multitude of producers on this album. So you have names that are not as common in 2004 that Snoop is given a platform with this album, such as J.R. Rodham and Warren Campbell, aka Baby Dub. There's also a producer on here by the name of Joseph Lineberg, or Joseph Lienberg. So I think Terrace Martin is actually in the credits of this album for the production camp old folks that contributes to Fresh Pair of Panties on this album. There's also a producer named Black Jerules who shares production credit. Then on top of that, you have the benefit of extended family production going on here. And what I mean by that, it's expected that you're going to have names pop up from longtime collaborators that are considered in-house, such as LT Hutton and Superfly, but you also have the benefit of being part of what's going on at the time with Aftermath, Shady, G-Unit and the Interscope family in general. And so Snoop is pulling from all of those angles, and he has access to folk like Sha Money XL, who is a real guiding force and a heavy presence in the G-Unit projects back at that time. So Sha Money XL is behind the boards on tracks. With that, at this time, The Alchemist, who is mostly associated with Mobb Deep, is pulled in because they had just joined G-Unit, and so he does the introductory track. And in the same way, you get High Tech, who was finding himself being a very much sought after producer on the West Coast through this camp, doing a lot of work with G-Unit and the whole Shady Aftermath family, and so he gets a production credit on here as well. And then you have Mr. Porter, who is a member of D12, and it really started making a name for himself this year in particular with his offerings on the albums by Young Buck and Lloyd Banks. So here he is too, all at the disposal of Snoop to put on and use. Then you have some standouts like Ron Browse from Harlem, shout out to Harlem, collaborating with Sha Money XL on the track that features 50. So that makes a who's who of producers contributing to this album, sharing the boards with the Neptunes. And then, of course, since it's 2004, you have the requisite Lil Jon production on Step Your Game Up. Okay, so you're getting a range of sounds, and somehow they all work together to give you this crispness. And what happens here is that there's a doubling down and an all-in aspect to things that you've seen Snoop dabble with, right, on the two previous albums. But this is legitimately the first time in a while that Snoop's album production is ahead of its time. And so it can't all just be credited to Chad and Pharrell, because they're seeking like-minded new producers or old-time producers who are doing new things. The drum patterns on a track like The Business and a track like Can You Control Your Hoe are clunky but organized and full. So you're getting this really rounded kind of feel from them. They're not all over the place. Then you're getting more East Coast inspired production on a Snoop album than you've gotten in a while. And so it becomes apparent on tracks like Snoop D-O Double G, where yes, the hook makes it sound like a no-brainer Snoop song because of the melody that he chooses to follow, but it's the beat that provides that melody in the first place for Snoop to kind of Snoopify that song. Otherwise, if you heard the instrumental by itself, it would seem very tailor-made for an East Coast rapper with the bells and the slinky bass line. I think it's not until those keys come in and make that hook melody where you're like, okay, I can hear Snoop on this, because it kind of has that bouncy playfulness to it. But by itself, especially the introductory bars, the 8 bars leading into it, it's like, okay, yeah, this sounds like something that a New York rapper would be on right now. You could say the same thing about I Love to Give You Light, the introductory song that The Alchemist provided, because it's the only track on here that directly uses a soul sample. While the whole album's filled with pulling soul from different places, this is capitalizing off that feel, the last kind of year of that sped up vocal sample, old feeling, rapping over. It sounds like something that Freeway would be leading off for, and any other rapper of that ilk, if they did it, you're like, oh, they're killing it, right? And Snoop chooses to kind of be more lyrical on that song anyway because of that groove, but it's the only track on the album like that. And then, of course, the song Oh No, which has the dark synths and the dark strings, the deep violins, it's supposed to be the menacing song, but it's East Coast menacing, something that you imagine 50 Cent would appear on, which he does with like the hard bass line and the hard drums, where The Business is the West Coast version of that. It's that riding, but I'm about to get into something. It's clunky. It's made for hydraulics. It's like the clashing of those sounds that you know that something's going down. But then there's tracks that dabble into straight R&B-ish territory. Signs, being the most poppy song on here, still manages to fit because this album is playing with such crisp, futuristic instrumentation that it employs soul. And the way it's done by the Neptunes is a masterclass in how you bring both of those worlds together. So you think about this full out ventures into R&B territory, right? Can You Control Your Hoe is probably the most traditional Snoop Dogg sounding song here. And then they go even further with tracks like I'm Through With You and No Thing On Me. No Thing On Me, which High Tech just samples straight from the original Curtis Mayfield song. And I'm Through With You is almost a mid-tempo ballady, but it allows Snoop to, like I said, double down. We've heard Snoop sing on songs before now, but he's just all out, and it's because the beats allow him to do that. Producers understood the assignment, but again, no one understood the assignment more than the Neptunes. What is done on a track like Let's Get Blown, which is a full-out interpolation of the song Watching You by Steve Arrington's band Slave. Always feels weird saying the name of that band, but obviously Snoop loves this song. This is the same track that he snatched the hook from for his hit Gin and Juice off his debut album. He's so free at this point in his career that he's like, you know what, I'm just going to remake that song. I'm just going to make a hip-hop version of that song. So down to the airy synths that are playing in the background and rounding the beat out, filling it out, besides it just being these squeaky electro synth sounds that Pharrell's added in there. They are really capturing it down to the snares. And this is the beginning of maybe about a 5 to 7 year period of Pharrell showing how closely he can interpolate songs, right? And if we think about what was coming out, like tracks like Nothing by Nori, with Pharrell paying homage to the JBs coming through by the Jungle Brothers with that, up to the famous Blurred Lines by Robin Thicke, which wound up becoming a lawsuit by the Marvin Gaye estate, which they won, and became very controversial for music makers, because it's evident that while casual folk may say, oh, it was a jack, or he jacked the beat, it's clear from a musician standpoint that all Pharrell did was arrange similar notes in a similar way to pay homage. I don't even think anything was sampled on Blurred Lines. But here on Let's Get Blown, it's a mix of both. He's doing that really, really pristine interpolation plus a little sampling. So credit is given there. Now Signs is like a futuristic but retro feel. All those same electronic sounds, but giving you that funk. Signs manages to sound more pop than a song that samples the Bee Gees, Ups and Downs, which has Bee Gees vocals on it from their song Love You Inside Out. Ups and Downs still manages not to sound as pop as Signs does because it's so glitzy, but they're able to still combine the heart of what would be a Confunction type song or Gap Band type song, hence Charlie Wilson. Now the ahead of its time element is mostly why we're talking about this album as a classic. I don't know if it's the first album that pops up in most people's thoughts when they're thinking about classics in Snoop's catalog, but what can't be denied is the sonic impact. What you're hearing by the midpoint of the album is music that there wasn't even a subgenre created for at the time, that is now very popular listening music, or what the kids call vibe music. And I challenge anyone who loves that kind of music or hip hop to listen to as many of the instrumentals you could find from this album and see if it doesn't sound like what you hear in collections like Soulection or on lo-fi channels. It's just like tracks like Promisade without the lyrics, just the spacey, airy, but deep soulfulness of that groove is like, where were you at right there? It's that dreamscape kind of feel. Fresh Pair of Panties On sounds like trap soul, but it has this unorthodox drum pattern. And this always throws me off, man. I don't know what pocket Snoop was rhyming in, but if anybody understands the count of that beat, it sounds like a 3/4 count with those drums. And I wish a rapper more proficient in that style of rap would have rolled the beat so we can hear how it sounds. I should try it actually, because that beat is very unorthodox. The delay of the drum is like on Dilla time. It's like on slow motion Dilla time, while the beat itself with the Rhodes piano and the bloop, 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 really, really different stuff. The drums LT Hutton was using with the chimey sounds on Girl Like You. Can I Get a Flick With You? It's just, all of these things are are different. And of course, we can't not talk about the monster that was Drop It Like It's Hot with its back to basics approach, which sounded like nothing at the time. This was the same effect that Clips had when they dropped Grindin', which was also the brainchild of the Neptunes, to say, hey, let's not do all this musicality. Let's not do all of this layered instrumentation. Let's strip it down to a new form of boom bap. It's industrial boom bap, right? With I read something that said when the keys come in, they sound like lightning bolts from the sky. That din, 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 which by itself wouldn't sound like much, but to come into accent beatbox mixed with like what sounds like big band bass drum hits, Drop It Like It's Hot is a hit 50% because of what the beat introduced to hip hop. So yeah, all those things are things to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about the quality of the production on this album. That takes us to dimension 2, the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. All right, so somehow, some way, how does all of this manage to flow together as an album? This is a big full album, 20 tracks, really 19 of them being songs, all these different producers I just named, and they're all seeming like they're all on one accord. Maybe because they're all kind of arm's distance away from each other, working together on projects at that time, so they're all in that same headspace. Or maybe Snoop and Pharrell and Chad came with the vision of how they wanted this album to sound. They didn't want it to sound like G-Funk or Dr. Dre or anything prior, or the Southern No Limit stuff. This was a new direction for Snoop. And so with that, if that was the messaging that everyone took, that's what you got. There's nothing here that sounds rehashed or recycled. Even when they slow it down and go into more R&B-ish territory, it's still with new types of notes. Can You Control Your Hoe and The Business have some West Coastiness to it, but those new type of drums change where it's going. There are things that sound a little timely. Snoop, D-O-double-G, and Step Your Game Up, because of the Lil Jon, all the standard Lil Jon sounds of the day sound very much like that era of the 2000s, but they're still so crisp that it doesn't sound outdated. Not yet, at least. The most pop sounding song on here, Signs, is still able to blend in somehow because of the soulful and funk element. It has the most glitziness to it. Signs sounds like it's ready for the Vegas Strip, but it still works because I think Charlie Wilson's presence there anchors it, and because there's so many of those kind of electro funk sounds throughout this album, it's not a sore thumb. Yeah, the soulfulness of I Love to Give You Light is a different soulfulness from Promise I, which is a different soulfulness from the subdued kind of feel of Girl Like You, and it leaves space for the more menacing tracks like Oh No, Bang Out, and The Business to be placed right where they need to be. Bang Out is the second song after I Love to Give You Light, and Oh No is towards the end. And you can debate on what's harder and what's not based on what Snoop is saying in between there. But even for a long album, there's some thought put into where they want the tonalities to go and fluctuate. In the middle, you do get a series of women-based songs. It starts at Let's Get Blown and goes to Fresh Pair of Panties, and then he goes back into some other territory before rounding out again with Can You Control Your Hoe, I'm Through With You, and Girl Like You. So clustering those tracks together, always interesting choices when rappers do that. But there's so many songs on here that it doesn't have that first half, second half type of feel. But that's something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 3, the intentional mood and tone of this album. Okay, this is not a rebrand for Snoop. This is not a divorce party. This is not a relaunch. This is just a new direction for Snoop. If anything, it is like an offshoot of the direction that he started with Beautiful, and it is the pimp who can fall in love kind of chapter of Snoop's catalog. And even though the title purports that it's going to be this rhythm and gangsta album, where it's so soulful and so R&B based with the hardness. It doesn't really execute that in any clear way where you're like, oh, this is the gangster side and this is the R&B side. Maybe it's characterized mostly by the fact that this is the most singing on an album that you've heard Snoop do up until then. Chanting wise, full out singing, playing with vocal tones, having so many guest singers on the album, all of that counts. So maybe that's where the R came from. The G is more P. You know, if this was R and P, which doesn't have as good of a ring to it, it would make a lot of sense, because Snoop talks about cripping a lot. He talks about his set, but more than that, he talks about the pimp life. The flip side of that is that he shows that he has a heart. He's talking about getting with a girl. He's talking as if he's a single man, and making this distinction between women that he wants to pursue and women that he wants to put in check. That's about as close as you get to a deliberate tone that's said through the vocals, what's said on the album through rap. Sonically, the tone is set by how these worlds are coming together of soulfulness and future next up sounds. But y'all tell me if y'all got anything else from that as far as intentional mood and tone, something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 4, the song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds. Okay, so production-wise, with all these producers, I can't imagine there's a bunch of room, if any, for things to get redundant. And trying to think if there's any tracks on here that sound like each other. Not in any obvious way. I'm sure a music purist, a music theorist would be able to break down the similarities in chord progressions that the Neptunes use, since they kind of pull from similar sound banks for different tracks, but not any obvious stuff here. So then that takes us to the words, and Snoop being a very easy target for lazy writing, pointing out and call outs. Yeah, you're going to get lots of repetitive and uninspired writing here when Snoop is in charge. And we'll talk about it. We'll process that more in category 2. But yeah, I mean, you're going to hear him claim his set. You're going to hear him talk about smoking. And you're going to hear pimp. You're going to hear him spell his name or say his name in all the different variations. Big Dog, Snoop, D-O-double-G. Boss is going to come up a lot. But yeah, a lot of pimp language. At this point in Snoop's career, listeners should know what to expect. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 5, the amount of content versus the amount of songs. All right, I mentioned there are 20 tracks here, 19 of them being songs because you have one interlude skit before Fresh Pair of Panties. And of that 19, there are some earnest efforts by Snoop to talk about things that are things, right? The beginning track, I Love to Give You Light, is him reflecting on his life. And then he does the same thing on the final track, Think, through singing and talking. But the talking is some of the most in-depth pontification that you'll get out of Snoop's career, honestly. In the middle, in the early middle, you have Ups and Downs, which is, it seems like a short-sighted attempt at Snoop trying to do some reflection and introspection, but he just goes in different spaces. And that's about it with the deliberate, substantial stuff. In between that, you get different shades of how he talks about women. So I mentioned that stretch that happens in the middle of the album from Let's Get Blown to Fresh Pair of Panties, different aspects. So Step Your Game Up, it may sound like a battle rap type song, and for Trina it might be, but for Snoop it is all a pimp testimonial and tutorial, and he's talking about what he would do to an out of line chick and how she needs to step her game up, and pimps need to step their game up in checking their chick. But again, that sandwich in between songs like Perfect, where he's trying to recreate, he even says it's Beautiful Part 2, where it's all complimenting a woman with class and style, a woman that he actually respects and is not approaching with his pimp hat on. As opposed to Let's Get Blown, it's more like come hang with Snoop. You already know who I am. You know what you're getting into. Come smoke with me and hang out by the pool, and whatever happens, happens. Fresh Pair of Panties is more sexual in nature. It's like, hey, let's get down to it. Promised Eye, another pimp hat song. And then further songs about women are, again, in that pimp vein. I'm Through With You is a return to the misogyny that Snoop damn near made his brand when he first came out with Dre. And then Can You Control Your Hoe? It's all, I'm a pimp looking at, these dudes do it wrong. This is what you should have done. And then lastly, Girl Like You returns to the softer, can I get with you? How can I be down with you? Beautiful woman. Other than that, the rest of the album, same way. There's tonalities of playful Snoop and gangsta Snoop. So Bang Out, The Business, Oh No, it's gangsta Snoop. He's talking about, riding on fools, smoking fools. And then the playful Snoop songs are like Snoop D-O-double-G, Pass It, Can I Get a Flick with You? There are deliberate spaces that Snoop wants to take you to on different songs. He may not give you the most topical, substantial, or deep material, and he probably never has or will. But for this album, it's mapped out in those 4 sections at least. And what he doesn't give you with these, hard topics, he gives you with different shades of this conversation. All these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 6, the features. All right, I've been spouting some of these names out as we go. Let's get a full list. So I'll start with the famously uncredited Keisha Cole, because she was not famous at that point. She's gone on to sue Snoop and the Neptunes for not being titled and given her proper due or payment from her vocals lent to the songs Pass It, and Let's Get Blown. And I think she's in the video for Let's Get Blown. But because these were recorded around the time when Keisha was about to really come out, it lines up being a single that's released when Keisha Cole had made the name for herself. But at the time of her recording it, she was just an upcoming singer under Interscope that was about to be out. I hope they resolve that, because 2 Libras, Keisha and Snoop working with an Aries Pharrell, that should iron itself out. And I used to have a big crush on Keisha Cole. Don't ask me why. I can give you 2 reasons why. But Oakland, shout out to Oakland. But yeah, naturally you get Pharrell featured. Pharrell's doing falsetto, singing on some tracks. He's doing background on some tracks. He's famously rapping a scene-stealing verse that, thank God, adds a more lyrical texture to the song Drop It Like It's Hot, and some famous lines in hip-hop history. You also have Trina, who I mentioned. You have Lil Jon, who, man, does the first verse on Step Your Game Up and makes it clear from that point that this is going to be a raunchy song. It winds up being probably the raunchiest and most expletive-laden song on the album until you get to I'm Through With You. You have Bootsy Collins. Bootsy Collins is doing background ad-libs, talking and singing on 2 tracks. He's on Can I Get a Flick With You, and he's on the end on No Thing On Me, which is so interesting because, like I said, it's a Curtis Mayfield remake, but Bootsy is adding vocals on it and hyping it up. Really cool. You don't really see those kind of mashups like that. And of course you have Uncle Charlie on there, Charlie Wilson, on Perfect, prominently featured, and then doing the alley-oop on Signs with Justin Timberlake. And it's the pairing that you didn't expect, but it really works. It's like the pairing you didn't know you needed. You need Justin's pop falsetto, but you need Charlie to add that grounded soul and funk to it. You have 50 Cent, you have Nelly. So it really is like the hottest of that era, 2004, of the established artists, not the new artists. And they all complement Snoop pretty well. It's contrast that he hadn't explored on previous albums. It's pairings that he hadn't seen done. And, funny enough, nobody from the immediate camps are anywhere to be found on this album. There's no Dog Pound, there's no Shady, there's no Dre, Never any complaints about who was featured on this album. It could be argued that on a long album, you need that variety to break up any monotony from hearing the same person for so long, especially someone with such limited content. But it would be a statement to make that Lil Jon's presence was probably over the top, and the things he was saying on Step Your Game Up, especially for that to be the first verse of the song, it's like, where was this track intended to go? Snoop has never been a PG rapper anyway, but it's like, oh, how hard were you trying to go for what audience? Which takes us into the next dimension. So this is all something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Dimension 7, the question of, do the weakest songs, or does the weakest song on the album bring it down? All right, that's subjective. It's always up to you. Are there any weak songs? We know it's always mentioned on this channel that 10 is the golden number, 12 to 14 is the typical range for hip-hop classics. Going above that ups the risk for you to have filler content, forgettable songs, or easy skips. This having 19 tracks makes it no exception. It is not exempt from that. Y'all let me know what y'all consider to be the weakest songs on here, if any. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. If the goal was to take Snoop in a new direction, remember, his album prior to that is the album that had the smash hit Beautiful on it, and it also had a couple other hits. So it's not like he was hurting for commercial attention and success and fame and acclaim. Snoop by this point is more of a name and an icon because of his personality and who he is than any album that he could put out. But this is still the era of album sales, physical media, and labels mattering. So with this move, it's safe to come to the conclusion that the intention was to raise the bar for Snoop. What can we do now that we have Snoop in our wheelhouse? Okay, well, we can now go somewhere where we haven't been. And that's exactly what happens. Drop It Like It's Hot comes out, and it's the wave that took everyone by storm. They didn't know that they needed a new Snoop song in their life, and that's what they got. It's followed by Let's Get Blown, which becomes one of those songs that everybody has in their playlist, even though it wasn't one that made a lot of noise on the charts when it came out. But it's one of those songs that everybody instantly gravitates to, probably because of the cheat code effect of that Watching You song. And then Signs got a lot of MTV rotation. I remember Signs getting played a lot. This played a big role in Charlie Wilson's reemergence as a soloist. So we talk about reemergence, rejuvenation. Charlie Wilson is the one who had a second life and career from his collaborations with Snoop because of songs like this. So Beautiful followed by Signs. It's like, okay, now we're ready for, hey girls, how you doing? My name's Charlie. You get all that because of these steps. And then last but not least, Ups and Downs is the last official single from the album. But what's not being talked about here is that there's a whole movie that accompanies this album. And this is part of the era of real genius marketing going on in the hip hop world. We got 3D video computer games that are being added to CDs, or links when you get the album. iTunes is becoming a thing, so people are able to go online and get their music. File sharing is still the scourge of the industry, so people are trying to come up with all these creative ways to market their albums to make sure that people are still going platinum. Platinum was still king at this time. And so there's a movie called Bossin' Up that Snoop independently funds. It's meant to be like the Idlewild was for the Love Below Speakerbox album, where it's not the official, here's a video for every song, but intertwined in the movie is a video for damn near every song off of this album in particular. He records a couple tracks that are specifically for the movie, but the premise is he is a pimp who falls in love, which speaks to the idea that I pointed out when we were talking about the intentional mood and tone. And he winds up trying to pimp his girlfriend out for them to get to a better life. So, I mean, it's actually a quality movie. Of all of the rapper-made movies, This is up there. This is like in my top 3 personally. So check that out if you haven't. I watched it with my wife and she approved. So that adds to it if you were one of the folks that were really invested into Snoop at the time, or just were watching movies on spaces that had those direct-to-video black movies. It used to come on cable. The last couple years of Blockbuster, you could find it. The beginning of Redbox and Netflix, you can find that movie now. You can find it anywhere, bossing up. But all that stuff adds to the popularity, let alone what the songs do themselves, because the Neptunes are such a major force in music. So this was destined, just off the Neptunes produced singles alone, to have legs. But you can pull from a whole nother quadrant or third of this album and have singles. Can I Get a Flick With You, Snoop D-O-double-G, Girl Like You could tell that was intended to be a single. Nelly was hot as fish grease at the time still, so putting that out would have still made a wave. Step Your Game Up with Lil Jon, which winds up having a video at the end of that movie. Again, I don't know if it was intended for the strip club or if it was intended for Vegas parties or whatever, but that would have hit too, because Lil Jon was the hottest thing moving besides the Neptunes in 2004, if not the biggest thing, right before the snapping movement came out on the production end. So all the bases are covered for this to have mass appeal, for this to go global, for this to hit men, women, even though a lot of pimp talk. Snoop is mindful to have, at least two tracks or so where he's talking a little bit more delicately to women, which for Snoop is a new thing that he just tapped into on the album, where he had Beautiful and I Believe in You. You never rap love songs from Snoop, so he's going into that direction and securing that as much as he's got all the pimp talk. But the pimp talk may be justified because he's got this pimp movie. All these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. The album does go platinum, so mission accomplished. All right. Dimension 9, my favorite, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. Okay. I started this episode off by saying that this is a skewed classic. Might be skewed because maybe I'm the only one who considers it classic. The buying audience obviously considers it classic because of the songs that come from the album, and I think if for no other reason, for the layman, this would be brought up in the classic conversation because of the presence of the hits that came from it, even if you don't agree as a body of work that it's one of Snoop's most classic albums. And Drop It Like It's Hot alone being a newer song, a song that just is turning 20, but revered and up there with the top billing and Buddy and My Adidas of hip-hop history, is a huge deal. This personally was such a big song that I was anti-cell phones at the time. I got my first little mobile prepaid cell phone and got my one and only ringtone ever in life, and it was Drop It Like It's Hot, because I like how it sounded as a ringtone. This song was ubiquitous. It is a mega monster hit to this day. It became one of those songs that once you see it cross over and elderly white people know it, it's gone. That's how huge it is. My father came up to me and was like, yeah, when the pigs try to get at you. So it changed the direction of where we knew hip-hop production could go from there on. You saw a new wave of experimentation once we got to 2006, because this new precedent set in 2004 that allowed producers to step away from the soul sampling cage that had happened, or the Lil Jon cage that had happened and had a grip on the mainstream radio. It's like, oh, we can do something else. Which partially, if you want to dive deeper, you can say that maybe snap music is an offshoot of that more stripped down approach that was introduced by this song. But yeah, just off that alone, I already mentioned my reasoning for considering it ahead of its time because of the pairing of the futuristic sounds in R&B. It reminds me of Aaliyah's final album, which I personally think was way ahead of its time production-wise. Shout out to Static Major, rest in peace, because they were playing with sounds that just no one else was doing in R&B at the time. Same way here with this album, especially because it had that R&B bass, futuristic soul. Look it up. Play a Terrace and Martin album right now. and the beats on this album sound like the predecessor for that. So I mean, that's impact, innovation, and influence in a nutshell, but something for you all to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to the final dimension, dimension 10, the overall timelessness and uniqueness of this album. That's the cool part about being ahead of your time, is that by the time this even has a chance to sound outdated, it's so late in the game now. It's 20 years later. Maybe you might hear a song, or you might hear a detractor say, oh, that Lil Jon song sounds like the Lil Jon era, and I don't want to hear that era. But other than that, I mean, you know, it's not finding a trend, it's trying to create a trend, and it did. And I think it preserves it. I think it rescues it from any real risk of it sounding cringy. At least beat wise. Now, what Snoop is saying, what he's talking about, some of that doesn't age well, stand the test of time. Step your game up. Where he's about smacking women. I'm through with you. Real misogynistic, like I said, going back to putting hands on women. You know, how Snoop has not been Me Too'd. Let me not be the one that brings that up to make him get Me Too'd. But it speaks to how much of a character in rap he is. No one really takes him seriously. All throughout this album, he's talking about gang banging and pimping, and they're like, oh, Snoop. so yeah, I mean, it's unique in Snoop's catalog because he goes on to play with different sounds in his later albums. We know what happens on the album where he does sexual seduction, but I don't think you get sexual seduction before he's playing with singing on this album, which he set the foundation and precedent for on the 2 albums before this. So it's a natural evolution, but because this is the Neptune's first foray album with Snoop, it sounds like none other in his catalog. And you don't get this era of Neptune's production focused on a rap album so much again. Yeah, this is commercial height Neptunes. And this is where it was still Neptunes, not just Pharrell. This is one of the last eras for that. So all these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And with that, I conclude this category 1 breakdown and review of the classic album RNG, the Masterpiece by Snoop Dogg. Join me for video 2, category 2, where we go over Snoop's rap performance on this album. Oh boy. And until then, y'all know what it is. F a Rap Critic. They talk about it while I live it. Word to Matt.